Just as Conservatives will not leave our children a fiscal deficit, we will also not leave them an environmental deficit. That is my vision for Canada. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
That was Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer revealing his climate plan. It's just finished, I guess, to a crowd in Quebec. The Conservatives' climate plan involves sort of three key points. Here are those key measures. First of all, they announced that a Conservative government, according to Andrew Scheer, would remain committed to the Paris Agreement targets. That plan, he says, would, quote, give Canada the best chance of reaching the targets. He used the word chance, though. Mr. Scheer would also scrap the carbon tax, and he went on at length in the speech about that, and instead set a cap on large emitters. If companies surpass that cap, they'll have to make investments in green technology, and the Conservatives would offer a green homes tax credit to encourage Canadians, they say, to make home improvements that save energy. It would cost the government, though, $900 million a year. Mr. Scheer is taking questions right now from reporters, but we'll also be interviewing him when he's done that. So I want to bring in the power panel to get their take on the plan that we just heard. Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance joins us from Toronto. Alongside her, Earnscliffe Strategy Group's Kathleen Monk. Here with me in studio, Tim Powers of Summa Strategies and the host of CBC Radio's The House, Chris Hall. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Hi. So we all listened to that. Chris, I'm going to start with you. I guess, what's the big headline for you?
Well, that he says that he has the best chance of reaching the Paris targets that the Conservative government originally agreed to. And so that's an interesting admission, but it doesn't say that they will, just that there's a better chance of doing it with this plan. And secondly, that they are going to go after those large industrial emitters that have been excluded in large part from what the Liberals have produced so far. So there is a very clear and different vision for how best to tackle climate change, very different from what the Liberals have proposed and certainly what the NDP and the Greens are proposing
Tim,
as well.
is there going to be a credibility issue here, the idea that there's you know what I mean? There's no promise here to meet those targets. They're adopting them, but they're saying we'll give you the best shot at it.
That might be a challenge. I'm sure you'll ask him about it. But can I tell you something else that I see here? And Amanda and Kathleen may recognize it as well. What a pronounced shift in 11 years by the Conservative Party. We had an election in 2008 where Stéphane Dion was derided for his green shift. You now have a leader of the Conservative Party saying climate change is real. It's an acknowledgement, I think, in large measure, one, to the issue, but two, to the political potency of the issue. What I found fascinating relating to your question on credibility were the names Andrew Scheer talked about when he began his speech. John A. MacDonald, Robert Borden, John Diefenbaker, Brian Mulroney, ne'er a mention of Stephen Harper, all progressive Conservatives, or a version of that party, all who had done something that was seminal in the day, ending with Mulroney, who was, in I think 2007, was it not, Chris, voted greenest prime minister of the time. So this was a
name also often invoked by the Liberals, actually.
Yeah, by Catherine McKenna. Yeah. As Chris said, and I'll obviously let my other panelists speak, I think now there is an arena to have a debate. The Conservatives have clearly acknowledged, and Amanda can laugh, but there will be certainly many people there who will look at this and say, maybe some of what Scheer is talking about, I'm prepared to discuss. And if you're an environmentalist, you now can say, I may not agree with this plan, but now we see all the major parties talking about climate change.
Amanda and Kathleen are both laughing, so tell us why. Amanda, start with you.
Well, you asked about credibility, and I think that that's the single most important thing that we can highlight here. They have done nothing to amass any credibility capital whatsoever. In fact, they're working on a credibility deficit, and they have been for some time. It's been 416 days since they've had something to say on climate, and they deliver it in the final hours of Parliament. And when they do, they have to come out to declare how they're going to reach those Paris Agreement targets, and yet there isn't anything in there around emissions targets. That's the single most important thing that needs to be in this long 60-page, multi-thousand-word...
Do you mean that it's not disclosed kind of like what... they have a number of policies they're announcing. What's missing is exactly how much those policies individually will reduce emissions.
Exactly. It's called results. You can talk a lot about all of these terms and policies and bank so many of them that he'll be there all night in order to deliver them. But you have to also tell Canadians what your results are, especially when you're dealing with a credibility credibility deficit, especially when, a modern day conservative movement, recent modern conservative leaders, Jason Kenney, Doug Ford, even Andrew Scheer himself, have had a hard time answering the question whether humans have contributed to climate change. So when you're dealing with that kind of deficit, you better be prepared to put the numbers into the plan.
Is the pressure, though, not as direct on him, Kathleen, because though the Liberals have made very specific promises, they are, as Mr. Scheer points out, not going to meet those targets either at this point?
Well, there's a couple things in your question. I think that the Liberals are struggling because they're frankly fighting a multi-front war now. They have the Greens going against them, they have the New Democrats going against them, and now the Conservatives come out with their climate plan. But let me talk about his speech specifically. Listen, I think Scheer did a good job at defining the problem today. He laid out the fact that we're likely not going to reach the Paris targets. But what he didn't do, he failed on a number of counts. Amanda already pointed out he doesn't have the data. In all those 60 pages, those 11,000 words that he kept on quoting, he doesn't have the data, he doesn't have the numbers, and I'm sure some journalists on site are going to question that. But a couple other things. Tim just mentioned all those progressive conservative leaders he referenced. Guess what? That's not the Conservative Party anymore. It has changed. And the one thing he didn't do that I was expecting and would have signaled a significant change in conservative policy, if he actually said, under Harper, guess what? We didn't get the job done. Under the current version of this Conservative Party, we didn't get it done. And I'm going to change that. But any leader that tries to go out in the public and tries to kind of create a fanciful tale that it's not that Canadians aren't going to have to put a price on carbon is frankly disingenuous. There can be lots of hopeful policy levers that we put in place, great policies, and there are some good ideas that the Conservatives tabled today. But to say to Canadians that there's not also going to be some pain in that there has to be both carrot and stick is just disingenuous.
I can pick up on a couple of things. One is that we often criticize Andrew Scheer for speaking only to the base. Well, today, by citing those progressive conservative former prime ministers, I think he's trying to reach beyond that base. So you have to give him credit for that, even though I accept that there is a bit of a credibility issue around the lack of numbers. No price for exceeding the limits for those companies of what they would have to pay. No numbers of companies that might be caught up by exceeding 40 kilotons a year, and certainly no long-term targets for these emission plans. That said, it's a nice backdrop. He's actually got something out there to have this discussion, and ultimately he's opened himself up to, well, what is the cost going to be? Yeah. Why is a carbon tax not going to work? Because in British Columbia, which has had one since 2008, it has succeeded in driving down emissions, although not necessarily as far as people would have liked. So he has to come back and be able to defend his plan as being able to reach those kinds of goals that the Liberals apparently will not be able to do.
Well, and the interesting thing, Tim, as well, to pick up on both your point and Kathleen, I mean, there is a cost, as the PBO points out. It's not just carbon tax is a cost. So are the things that Mr. Scheer announced today. A tax rebate of $900 million a year. Guess who pays for that?
Yeah, exactly.
There is a cost, right?
But this is also not a platform document at this point. It's a policy speech. I think he recognizes, and I'm sure you will take him to task as others will, when he gets to a platform, there will have to be costs. I don't think he's naive enough to assume that won't be the case. I mean, Amanda talks about credibility, and that's a great point to raise, because we also have credibility issues when it comes to the government and the actual price on carbon. When the PBO says it's really going to have to be higher, around $100, to get it done. So
if they don't do anything else.
If they don't do anything else.
Although there's nebulous claims there too, because the Liberals always say, oh, we're going to do all this with transit. It's dependent on a lot of hypotheticals as well, right?
Yeah, so I don't think anyone here holds the high ground on virtue and having the perfect plan. But again, I go back to this point. I do think now, let's not understate the significance. Kathleen's wrong in one respect. So, to characterize the Conservative Party as still being this child of Stephen Harper's and not recognizing, go back to the leadership race, he was derided for it at the time, but Michael Chong talked about this issue. Lisa Raitt has had
But Michael Chong talking about he wanted a carbon tax, and he was like,
are you kidding me?
But wait, guys, we have come from a conservative leader simply parroting carbon tax is bad, although he did start with that, to this today. It's a significant step within the Conservative Party, and I think they'd rather have the fight we're about to have here, diving into, well, this is a better measure than having your money pay for these problems when somebody else's could, who's actually invested in trying to do something in the economy.
I'm going to misquote it, but Maya Angelou has this great quote which says, when people show you who they are the first time, believe them, right? And what we know is that this Conservative Party, when they were last in power, gutted the protections around our lakes and rivers through the Navigable Waters Act. They actually muzzled scientists, continually who are working on the issues of climate change. So until actually there's an acknowledgement by Scheer and his the people who are writing his policy that was the wrong path and they're choosing a different path, until they acknowledge the damage that Harper's government did, I can't believe this, and there is that credibility problem.
But I don't think I ever saw Stephen Harper stand on a dais or in front of somewhere in Chelsea and say climate change is real when he was rolling out.
No, he was too busy
not that he didn't believe that it was,
against our rivers and lakes.
No, but I mean, again, let's not understate that. The Conservative leader now saying that comfortably, unafraid to say it, is a significant thing for the Conservative Party.
Amanda, last word to you before we take a
Well,
break.
and you talked a little bit about costs, and I think, while it's not a platform document, we're heading into an election, and probably the most important number beyond the targets is how much is this going to cost? And you can see by looking at this plan, it's going to cost more and do less. Even if you look at the retrofit program, which is a program that comes from the Harper era, this was a program that was so costly that it was canceled in 2012. And when you talk about clean tech, the Liberal government has made a ton of investment in clean tech, but clean tech doesn't work toward the Paris Agreement targets. So there's a lot of holes in this plan, and in the coming days, he's going to be taken to task on it. It's unfortunate that it's not in the House.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer has just delivered his plan for combating climate change, a plan Scheer promised over a year ago. He joins me now from Chelsea, Quebec, where he unveiled that plan. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Great to see you again. Thank you for your time.
Good to be able to chat with you today.
A large chunk of the speech that you made focused on the idea that Liberal policies won't meet emission reduction targets. I think the quote that you used right off the top was something like, you said that they have failed. But nothing you announced today gives any details about the specific emission reductions that would happen as a result of your policies. Why not?
Well, I reject the premise of that, Vashi. We did point to the Parliamentary Budget Officer report that indicated that our approach, by highlighting investments in technology, not just highlighting them, but accelerating them and incentivizing them, will have a greater impact on lowering emissions than the failed carbon tax. The PBO estimates that will get Canada over 100 megatons closer to our baseline Paris targets. In addition, we have concrete numbers that if Canada is able to leverage our technology when it comes to carbon capture, and can help facilitate the implementation of that in countries like China, where there are over 3,000 coal-powered electrical plants. If just 100 of them were able to implement Canadian carbon capture technology, we could reduce global emissions by 300 megatons. So there's a lot in this plan that is absolutely linked to concrete reductions estimations.
So what about, for example, the policy that targets heavy emitters? By how much would that reduce emissions? Because my understanding is there are still some questions about how many companies would qualify for the limit that you've set.
Well, the number is actually very clear. It's 40 kilotons. That is much more stringent than the Liberal plan, and we are very confident that this will lead to reductions in those emissions. And I must put it to you, Vashi, again, when you look at what Justin Trudeau promised Canadians in the last election, his environmental plan was completely uncosted and unmodeled. There was not even a guess. There wasn't even a plan to develop a plan to reach those targets. So we're very confident that working in concert with these other types of initiatives that we've brought in, that we can give Canada the best chance at achieving those Paris targets.
I take your point, but that didn't answer the question. How much will your heavy emitter policy actually reduce emissions?
Well, as I said, taken as a whole, not just the heavy emitters policy, but you have to also remember that we are introducing a green patent credit, which will be a magnet for entrepreneurs and innovators from around the world to come to Canada to develop that new technology here. So we are very, very bullish on the level of emissions that we can achieve, because what we do know is that this is being contrasted to a Liberal policy that is failing to meaningfully reduce those emissions. They are falling shorter, they are falling further and further behind every single year. That's why there is so much anticipation for this policy announcement. If the Liberal plan was working, if Canadians were happy with paying higher costs and there were reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. But I've unveiled a plan today that gives Canada the best shot at reaching those targets without imposing a carbon tax.
You cite the cost of the tax there, and you've cited the cost of the Liberals' plan quite often in the past few months, of course, when talking about it. How much will your plan cost Canadians?
Well, this is the beauty of this plan, because this won't cost taxpayers and it won't cost consumers. This is not about imposing new costs on gas and groceries and home heatings. This is about incentivizing investments in reductions. So Canadians are actually going to save. They're going to save up to $3,800 when they make investments in their own home. Things like high efficiency furnaces, things like better insulation. And companies will be able to save. Those larger emitters will be able to, instead of paying a fee to government, they can invest in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions within their own operations or creating industry alliances to tackle this in a more cooperative way, and that will lead to greater efficiencies. So that will actually lead to lower prices for consumers. We have some other measures in here that add up to about $2.5 billion in our approach. But again, Liberals measure their success in by how much more they spend. And we measure ours in how we actually get results. Our plan is affordable, it is meaningful, and it is comprehensive.
I have to challenge, though, the assertion that this won't end up costing Canadians anything. I mean, a tax break, for example, for retrofitting your homes, you've pegged at $900 million a year. That's $900 million taxpayer dollars.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's leaving that money in their own pocket. And again, this is the difference between Liberals and Conservatives.
But it costs
Liberals
federal
think that when you leave money in the pocket of, well, but it doesn't, but it's better for taxpayers. And again, this is the big difference between Liberals and Conservatives. Liberals think that any time the government can't get a dollar from a taxpayer, that it's somehow a bad thing. Conservatives believe that when we leave more money in the pockets of Canadians, and when we use these types of credits to incentivize behavior that will lower greenhouse gas emissions, that's actually a good thing. So I hope the Liberals challenge me on this. I hope they think that leaving up to $3,800 in the pockets of Canadians is somehow a bad thing for our economy.
All right, I have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Scheer.
Thank you very much.
That's Conservative Party Leader Andrew Scheer. So how does it stack up against the Liberals and other parties' plans? David McLaughlin is Director of Climate Change for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He's joining us from Winnipeg. Chris Reagan is the Chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, and he's in Toronto. Hello to both of you. Great to see you.
Nice to see you.
Chris, I'm going to start with you. So I just interviewed Mr. Scheer, and towards the end, he said that his plan would not have a cost to taxpayers. Of course, I challenged him on the idea that that retrofitting tax break is $900 million a year. But there are a lot of sort of the debate so far has very much been around pricing carbon or carbon tax and the cost of that. What do you think of the assertion that this isn't going to cost Canadians as much?
Well, I think as you pointed out in your questioning, I think anytime you're going to offer subsidies to either households or businesses for good behavior, shall we call it, it's going to cost taxpayers money. And if you're going to force large emitters to contribute to a technology fund of some sort, that is going to raise their costs, and that's going to translate into higher prices for consumers. So there's no free lunch here, Vashi. You can't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions for free. I think one of the problems with this plan, as I've seen it, is that it is based on wishful thinking, as if you can just wish in good and better technology, and you can't. I think this plan overall, it lacks ambition, it lacks coherence, and I think it lacks a lot of detail.
What do you think, David, especially around the potential effectiveness of the plan? Mr. Scheer's primary argument seemed to be that the Liberals are falling short on meeting the targets, that their plan is not effective, and that his plan will be more effective.
Well, he's offering up a plan that doesn't have a carbon tax. I think that's his salient point. If you want to have a plan or measures that takes you to somehow to Paris and the Paris targets and reduces emissions without a carbon tax, then his plan is the only one on offer. And I think that's really what he's mostly striving to cement in the minds of voters with the upcoming election. I mean, there are some interesting and I think useful points in the plan. I mean, the focus on large emitters is a good one, and it would be presumably pan-Canadian and have equal sort of status across those sectors. The retrofit programs, I think, is a very useful thing because energy efficiency does help reduce emissions. And I think obviously getting more technology, it is going to be a technology play in many ways that's going to help us, find a way to reduce emissions. The challenge, of course, is when does that technology come into effect? When does it actually have an impact? And we don't have any real numbers numbers in terms of what would be the GHG emissions curve and projections forward from the Conservatives yet on those specifics.
Yeah, they haven't provided that yet, though Mr. Scheer insisted that, other parties at this point haven't put that, hadn't modeled that information either. Chris, what do you think about the potential effectiveness of what they said today?
Well, I think it's 2 points, I guess. One is, I want to come back to the cost, because I think when you asked him about the cost of the plan and he was unable to give an answer, at some point, some group of economists will cost out his plan, and I think they will find that their plan is either more costly than the current government's plan, or it will be less effective at reducing emissions. The whole reason why almost every economist I've ever met supports a carbon price is because it's the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. In terms of effectiveness, it's interesting that the Conservative plan involves repealing the fuel tax that the government currently has, which applies to households and small businesses. And that represents a huge chunk of the economy's emissions, something between a half and 2/3. Well, if those emissions are off the table, then it's very difficult to see how they can come close to achieving the Paris targets, unless he's got some other trick up his sleeve in those 60 pages, 11,000 words, many, many photographs of himself and the family, and 55 plus substantive policies.
It is an interesting sort of point of differentiation, David, between the two parties, the focus on heavy emitters versus a focus on the consumption side of things. And Andrew Leach, an economist, an energy economist, was tweeting out some, I found very helpful, sort of a breakdown of the percentage of emissions in each province that can be attributed to heavy emitters versus otherwise. And it ranged from 7 to a high of 53%, I think, in 2017 in Alberta. What does that tell you about the potential effectiveness of either, really?
Right.
Well, it tells me and reinforces what I think we all know in terms of having good climate policy is you need to really get at all sources of emissions, and that if you just focus on one sector, one piece of it, in this case industrial emitters, it is important. They have to contribute, and you need policies that get their emissions down, but it's simply insufficient on its own. And so the value, I guess, of a carbon price and that Chris has talked about, of course, it goes right through the economy and sends the price signal, and it touches more things. So if you're not going to do that, then you really have to put in the window a bunch of other measures. And so there's some of that, I think, in the Conservative plan, but more would really need to be done if there is going to be an adequate hope of achieving Paris.
Chris, I also want to ask you about, sorry, go ahead. You want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to add that even on the large final emitters, what's interesting is that there's none of the output-based pricing that you see with the government's current policy. So the Conservative plan and the rhetoric for Andrew Scheer suggests that it's going to be better for the large final emitters. But the truth is that if you're not addressing the competitiveness issue with those emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries, then you are going to have a competitiveness problem. And the current government's plan addresses that.
Although he kind of indicated, I think they did indicate that it would address it in some capacity. Like they would look at each industry individually. I mean, I take your, like, I know what you mean about
unspecified, currently unspecified.
Yes, currently unspecified. I just wanted to follow up and ask you both, before I let you go, about something that I heard in the third part of that speech. Sort of the third plank is taking the fight global. And I feel like in the interviews that I've done over the past few months, I've heard it more and more, even from, for example, last week, a politician in Quebec with the government. And that is this idea that somehow by helping other countries reduce their emissions through, for example, the export of LNG, I don't know if it's specific that we'll get credit for it or that we should get credit for it. I wonder what you think, Chris, I'll start with you, about the potential for that to be something that's taken into account. I know that the federal government is looking at something as well like that.
Well, look, I think if Canada can export LNG to whoever wants it in the world, and we can do so profitably, I think we should be doing it. And the benefit to Canada will be the export sales. And if the world wants enough of that LNG and it drives up the world price, that will be a further benefit for Canada. But there's a distinction between those economic benefits that are very real and credits in an accounting sense for GHG emission reductions. In fact, if we were to increase our LNG production and exports to, for example, China, our emissions will probably go up, not down. And I think it actually is delusional to think that 196 other countries are going to give us some form of credit for actually selling that LNG to China.
David, final word to you.
Yeah, I think that the Conservatives should be careful about thinking of this as sort of a get-out-of-jail emissions-free card, that somehow if we just outsource our technology and have emissions fall elsewhere, that will be sufficient. There is still the domestic emissions piece that has to occur. And Canadians at some point maybe, will likely say, look, we seem to be spending money that's going elsewhere and they're getting the benefit of it and we're not really getting credit for it, et cetera. And so it's nothing, it's fine in theory, but it's a lot of work still to be done to get international buy-in and getting the accounting around it and getting the credits for it. In the meantime, we have to watch what happens to our emissions profile. So if it's a piece of the puzzle with other measures to reduce our emissions, some of them are in there, but there's probably more that has to come, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. But relying on it as sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card, I think would be a mistake.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you both very much for your insight today. Thanks to David McLaughlin and Chris Reagan.
Thanks, Vashi. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
The Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer put out his long-awaited climate plan today. It comes about a year after he first promised one. The Tory plan lowers emissions limits and focuses on technology, not taxes. Does Andrew Scheer's plan show the Conservatives take climate change and the issue seriously? Welcome to the Climate Change edition of the Premier's League. Earlier today, I spoke with Cathy Dunderdale, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador from 2010 to 2014, Kathleen Wynne, Premier of Ontario from 2013 to 2018, and MPP for Don Valley West right now, as well as Alison Redford, Premier of Alberta from 2011 to 2014. And hello, Premiers. nice to see you all. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's start off by talking about the Conservative plan that they are releasing today, their climate change plan. Ms. Redford, I'll start with you. What is the significance, do you think, of the plan politically for the federal Conservatives?
Well, I think that there's a lot of speculation out there and a lot of skepticism as to what the Conservative Party thinks about climate. We know that there's still lots of discussion, which is different than amongst other political parties in other places in the world, where there still seem to be people that are skeptical about whether or not climate change is real, which is kind of a shocking thing to say. But saying that, I think what we need to see, or what I'm looking to see today from Mr. Scheer, is commitment to Paris. Other discussions, as you and I have talked about, in terms of how you meet targets is something else. But at least being committed to Paris, I think it's important that we don't see that fall back anymore after the U.S. position. I think that the heavy emitter policy will be interesting. It's very similar to something that we did have in place in Alberta. I think the criticism of that, which is a fair criticism, is that that doesn't stop the emission, it just puts a price on the emission. And I think that we're getting to the point where we see that targets are going to be very, very difficult to meet, that may or may not be enough, depending on the specificity of the policy. So I think those are the risks today. We've seen very much reaction yesterday around the government's approach to climate emergency and pipeline, that there's a lot of contradictory feelings out there. But I think that what we need to start to see from federal leaders is an integrated approach to all of these issues. And I hope that that's what he talks about today.
We have been waiting a long time, Ms. Wynne, for the details of this plan. I think it was over a year ago that initially Mr. Scheer promised that they were coming sometime soon. Do you think the release of these details will help move the debate away from just centered on carbon tax or no carbon tax? And if that happens, is that a good thing?
Well, I think that carbon pricing or no carbon pricing is kind of a false debate. The debate should be, are we going to act on climate change or not? This is the single greatest threat to humanity. Are we going to do something about it or not? So what I would be asking for from any party leader is, how are you actually going to make a difference? How are you going to make sure that greenhouse gas emissions go down, that pollution goes down? And what is the impact on people's lives? One of the things that the Conservatives have always said is that the cost to people in their day-to-day lives is too much. What I've heard about the plan so far is that it's going to be very costly to the public purse. And the public purse is only what people who pay taxes in the country can afford. So I don't believe that there won't be an impact on people's lives, and I believe that it may be a far greater impact than what is already in place in terms of what Trudeau has proposed. So I think we have to look very, very carefully at what Mr. Scheer is suggesting.
How important do you think the release of this plan is for the Conservatives' sort of electoral hopes in the upcoming election?
I think it's critical. The people of the country understand that something very serious is happening. in our climate. We can see it every day in our communities. Somebody has to pay, and there's only one group of people, citizens in this country, who are going to have to pay. And I think we need to rip the Band-Aid off. We have to say what the targets are going to be, and we have to put in place actions. We have to convince people that there are actions that can be taken that will achieve the results that we're looking for. I think the time has passed when you can dance around this issue and you can argue about what costs more, what costs less. It is going to cost. People are prepared, I think, to pay that cost, and we need to get on with it.
Do you think there's some cynicism around the fact that successive governments have talked about targets, have put out plans, some more detailed than others, but in the end, as of yet, we are not on track to meet those targets?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think people are getting more and more impatient with governments who are doing that. That's why what they say today is so important, because I think people have a decision to make about where is it they can put the most trust that something is definitively going to happen, because it needs to happen, and it needs to happen now.
And Scheer's got a real challenge, because you've got a premier in Ontario, for example, who is stepping back from his responsibilities, and the country has benefited. I'm just speaking as the former premier of the largest province in the country, we did more than our fair share, because we are a greater proportion of the country than the people who are sitting beside me, and that's really important. And now we've got a premier in Ontario who's saying, oh, no, we've done our bit. We closed the coal-fired plants, even though he didn't. We did, but it's been done.
He does sometimes give you credit. I've had Minister Phillips on, and he does give you credit for that.
Yeah,
occasionally.
That's fair enough. But that work has been done, but there's more that we have to do, and it's okay if Ontario plays a greater role, because we create a lot of the problems. So I think Andrew Scheer's got a real challenge, because he's going to have premiers work with him.
I have to leave it there, but thank you to all three of you for your time today. Really appreciate it. What does the opposition have to say about the plan? Sean Fraser is Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Ed Fast is the Conservative Environment and Climate Change critic. Rachel Blaney is an NDP MP from BC, and Elizabeth May is the leader of the Green Party. They all join me from the House foyer. Hi, nice to see you all. Thanks for making time for us.
You're welcome.
We normally start off with the government in these panels, but because this is the Conservative plan that was released today, Mr. Fast, I wanted to start with you. Your party has criticized the Liberals' plan often for costing Canadians too much. Won't this plan cost Canadians a lot too?
No, we're eliminating the carbon tax in this plan. I think Canadians will welcome that decision. And what we're doing is we're pivoting to clean technology, and we're also making a special focus on the global challenge of climate change, because that requires a global response. Canada is perfectly positioned to deliver on that response.
First of all, though, the government, just to follow up, is rebating the money that they collect from the carbon tax. In addition, what you're talking about, for example, even let's just take the heavy emitter policy. So heavy emitters have to invest whatever, if they surpass 40 megatons, they have to invest money in green technology. Won't they on-pass that cost to the consumer, and thereby Canadians will actually pay for your plan?
Actually, I think there's a misunderstanding that there would be a cost to this, to the companies that are investing in their own environmental performance, because the more environmentally sound companies become, the more efficient they become, and the suggestion that there's a cost that would be passed on, I think, is an assumption that is not properly made. We believe our plan is actually going to incent companies to invest more quickly in environmental technology and improving their environmental performance, and thereby become more efficient and be allowed to pass on savings from that efficiency to consumers. Of course, consumers are going to see the carbon tax gone, so they are the big winners here.
Mr. Fraser, is your party truly in a plan to criticize the effectiveness of this plan, given that you're not on track to meet the current targets that you've set either?
Certainly, there's a couple of different things that I want to unpack there, and I'm confident that we are going to meet the Paris Agreement targets. But with respect to the comparison between our plan and the one that my colleague just laid out, your point about big emitters is well placed. Their plan is going to be less effective and more expensive They're getting rid of the rebate. When I hear Ed talking about the Canada positioning itself in sort of the world community to face this global challenge, it sounds great, but what it in fact is an abdication of our responsibility to take care of business at home. We're already taking part in global efforts to curb emissions, but there's no excuse not to show leadership at home and do what we can do locally to reduce our emissions in Canada.
Isn't your government, Mr. Fraser, also looking at the possibility of perhaps getting credits for exporting LNG if it helps other countries reduce their own emissions?
Our priority is to reduce emissions at home so we can demonstrate to Canadians that we're taking a leadership role in Canada. To the extent that we have LNG development that is displacing coal, if it does reduce global emissions, I think that could be a good thing, but that's not the crux of our strategy. Our focus is on measures that are being implemented today, like our price on pollution, like investing in public transit. There's over 50, I won't name them all for you, but our focus is on changing our behavior at home so we can play a leadership role in the global conversation about climate change.
Ms. Blaney, I know your party says that it would reduce emissions by more than the target set out by Paris. If cost is a concern, as it's sort of being characterized by the Conservatives today in the plan, and the Liberals in the past too have said there's, the NDP only cares about the environment, the Conservatives only care about the economy, we're looking at the middle. If that is the case, does your party kind of suffer because of that?
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that today we're talking about the Conservatives moving forward and actually talking about climate change, and that's a step in the right direction, so I will give them that. But we have to look at the targets and the Paris Agreement, and right now we see two plans that will not get us anywhere near that. So this is a crisis of epic proportions. We're seeing the scientific reality of the permafrost defrosting 70 years ahead of schedule. In my own riding, we are already having forest fires. I live in a rainforest. So when we look at the cost that it's going to take, there is no cost above the reality that we're dealing with right now. So if we don't take that action and we don't take it specifically, we're not going to get where we need to get to in this country. And the other part is Canada needs to be a leader, because innovation is also an important part of this. And I want to also just reach back to the announcement that the Conservatives made. And one of the things that I didn't hear that I would have really liked to hear was a lot more focus on building relationships with Indigenous communities. This has to be a fundamental core of any climate plan, and also working with workers. We didn't see anything that talked about where are we going. I come from a resource-based economy. I've lived in many of them in my life. We always leave them behind. There has to be a plan that says, as the climate changes, we understand people need important work. They need to be surviving. How are we going to work with them to support them during this transition? And it's coming whether we want it to or not.
Ms. May, the Conservatives unequivocally said, Mr. Scheer said in his speech, that climate change is real and acknowledged that something had to be done about it. Is that a step in the right direction, to use the term that Ms. Blaney referenced off the top of her answer?
Yeah, I think so. But the reality of this issue, unlike any other issue in politics really, is that there's an objective reality to it. So you can have opinions on many things, you can compromise on many things, but no climate change plan is worth the paper it's written on if it doesn't specifically address what we've been warned by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change must be done to hold global average temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, as we committed to do in the Paris Agreement. And there's so much confusion around this, so let me just say quickly, when we talk about the Paris target and going beyond it, there is a Paris target. The only one that matters is the one in the treaty. The one that Canada has is the same one that Stephen Harper put forward, that the Liberals have kept, and that Mr. Scheer's plan also maintains. It is completely inconsistent with achieving what must be done to ensure civilization survives. So there's a scientific reality here that neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives have agreed is critical. And they both talk about climate change being important, which is progress. But unless we're prepared to ensure that we go off fossil fuels in a planned and managed fashion so that we're using zero fossil fuels by 2050, we are actually paving a road to catastrophe for our own kids.
Mr. Fast, the language used today was clear that the plan will give Canada the best shot of meeting those targets, in part, a reference to what Ms. May said. It would not go so far, your party will not go so far as to promise anything. Is there a credibility issue there?
Well, I don't think there's a credibility issue there at all. In fact, if you look at our Conservative performance over 100 years, going back 150 years actually, under John A. Macdonald, who created the original National Parks Plan, moving through Brian Mulroney and the Acid Rain Treaty. We have a great record on the environment, and that gives us the credibility to say that this plan will provide us with the best chance of achieving our Paris targets. But Vashi, you know what? I was very pleased to hear my colleagues on the left say this is a step forward. I wish Mr. Fraser to my right could say the same thing, because I believe this is a huge step forward, because it acknowledges that climate change is not just a parochial issue. It is a global challenge that requires a global solution, which Canada is perfectly placed to
I'm running
deliver.
out of time. I want to give you each a really quick amount of time to respond. Mr. Fraser, you first.
Look, it's a step forward starting from a mile behind. The fact is there's an enormous credibility gap. And when you try to equate the Conservative Party of Canada today to Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives, this is a completely different party that doesn't take the threat seriously. The fact is their plan is going to be less effective, more expensive, it doesn't make sense, and it's not worth the paper it's written.
Have you read the plan?
I have.
Have you? I don't think you have.
Key part of this issue, and when you look at the proposed retrofit program that they're presenting, you know, that used to be happening. Small businesses across this country were doing that work. They were building that economy, and it was benefiting the economy and benefiting the environment. So now they're promising it again, but they canceled it before. So when you look at credibility and they actually talk about taking those actions, who's going to believe them?
Okay, last word, quick word to you, Ms. May.
Monday night in this Parliament, we voted that we are in a climate emergency. A climate emergency requires of us bold, serious action, and I'm afraid neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives are offering us that, but at least we know what the parameters are and we can discuss this and work together in an election campaign, and God, I hope we end up with a government that's committed to doing the right thing, which does require going off fossil fuels completely by 2050.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all four of you for your time this evening. Thanks to Sean Fraser, Ed Fast, Rachel Blaney, and Elizabeth May. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.